Today I'll be working in my workbook called Opening a Window into the Psalms. Now, I I have several books on the Psalms. I'm still working on the Psalms. Uh, and each of my titles have a sense of unveiling, a sense of opening, a sense of clearing the way, because the Psalms are mysterious in many ways. They are very different than what we're normally used to. The music has disappeared. The original um, music that went with them. And of course, they're being translated into English. So already some of the acrostics, for instance, have lost their connection. So there's a lot to be said about the Psalms. There's still a lot to be understood about the Psalms. In the first of the Psalm of each of the books, I will go through these summaries, but I won't do it now other than just give you a page. And if you're interested, if you're just clicking on this psalm, stop here and read this if you'd like. General study on the Psalms and separating the Psalms into groups. They're divided into several different 5 books. And so there's that. The musical nature of the Psalms. There's a lot of musical references to the Psalms. And these are what has to do with this particular book. And we have the poetic features of the Psalms. And that's what I get into a lot, is the poetic features, because that's what David and the authors of the Psalms use often to illustrate their poetic and poem or psalm. So anyway, we have did Psalm 1 already, the way of the blessed versus the way of the wicked. So today we're going to do Psalm 2, which is a mighty psalm. It is a reign of the Lord's anointed, as someone has given it a title. Now, just realize none of these Psalms actually had titles. These titles were given to them. Well, I think in New King James, they do have these titles on the various Psalms, but I think they were added later. They were not part of it. So let's read first the Psalm, and then we will talk about it. Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I've become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So obviously we can see this as having to deal with the Messiah. So let's first look at various comments about this psalm. Now, if you've been studying Psalms at all and using commentators, you realize that every commentator says something different about the Psalms. We go completely from Vernon McGee, who sees every psalm as related to the Messiah, to other psalms, other commentators who see things totally different. So what I've done is take a sampling of commentators' view on these psalms, and then I've also taken 2 commentators who've tried to put the psalm in a historical perspective. And so that's where I come up with this. Psalm 2 is in the first book of Psalms, which we know, as I said, there were 5 books of Psalms. The NIV Study Bible states that Psalm 1 and 2 are connected. Okay. According to both Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, which is a group of commentators, and the Nelson Study Bible, Psalm 2 is categorized as a royal or prophetic psalm, and that it definitely talks about the second coming of Jesus, but also can be used during the coronation of an Israelite king. Historically, royal psalms, even this prophetical psalm, may have been used in royal festivals in the temple and the coronation, so it seems logical to relate this psalm to the time during the late reign of David and early reign of Solomon. The Thomas Nelson Chronological Bible places it at the close of David's reign in 1 Chronicles 29. The Blue Letter Bible online believes it fits at 1 Chronicles 17:27, after the delivery of promise from Nathan to David that David's line will rule forever in 1044 BC. So you have two people thinking it a little differently. Acts 24:25 quotes from the psalm, attributes it to David. So even though there's not a authorship on this one, the book of Acts, Luke writes in the book of Acts that he attributes it to David already. So now I've divided it into 4 sections. The first is the rebellion, which is verses 1 through 3. Then the Lord's response, which is verses 4 through 6. This is followed by God's decree in verses 7 through 9. And finally, the warning to the nations, in verses 10 through 12. And then, since it's also prophetical, it has 2 meanings, both about David and Solomon's reign and also that of Jesus. So, first section is verses 1 through 3. Okay, first section. What is the question this psalm starts with? So, pretty easy to see here. The psalm starts with, why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? So you think of the end times and you think just before the second coming, the nations conspire and plot against Jesus when he comes again. And notice again, verses 1, 2, and 3 each have a poetic structure of synonymous parallelism. And this happens a lot in the Psalms. So synonymous means synonyms, okay? But sometimes it isn't just a word, but it's a whole phrase. So can you see it? So let's look at verses 1 through 3. So the verse 1 is, why do the nations conspire against the people, plot in vain, and the people's plot in vain? You see number 2 as being the first part of that, right? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together. They would be like the nations conspire, right? And the peoples. And then plot in vain. Let it see that against the Lord, against his anointed, let us break their chains, throw off their shackles. So 2 and 3 are actually synonymous, or paraphrasing, or another way of saying verse 1. And so that's where you see that structure there. Okay. Okay, let's start with the next page. What 4 groups listed in verse 1 and 2 come together to go against the Lord and his anointed? You have nations, peoples, kings of the earth, rulers, and so that's all. Nations, peoples, kings, and rulers, which the kings of the earth and the rulers are probably the same, but technically there's 4 of those. Prophetically, this is illustrated quite well at Jesus' second coming, when the world's armies are waiting to attack Jesus and his army. Notice some translations actually capitalize the word anointed in this psalm, meaning that it is more about Jesus than an earthly king. And you relate it to Revelations 19:19. Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and his army. Okay, very close to the second coming. In verse 3, what do the groups against the Lord or inhabitants of the kingdom want to do with the laws, chains, and shackles the king has given us to live by? They want to break off the chains and throw off their shackles. Okay. So now in the next section is the Lord's response. We have those questions and coming from the nation's perspective, and so 4 through 6 is the Lord's response. In verse 4, what does the one enthroned in heaven think about the plot of the nations? You see in verse 4, he laughs. He scoffs at him, like, really? Come on. How does the Lord respond to the nations in verse 5? He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, which again is as synonymous between each other. Rebukes in his anger, terrifies in his wrath, saying the same thing in different words. This compares to Revelation 19:15. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword, which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of the God Almighty. In verse 6, God tells where he has installed his king. Where is it? Verse 6, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. The word Zion has several meanings. It can be both the mountain that Jerusalem was built on or the heavenly Jerusalem. Therefore, this can either be the earthly king, like David or Solomon, or the heavenly king, known as Jesus. This compares to Revelation 14:1. Then I looked, when there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. Note also that the synonymous parallelism used in 4 and 5. I think I mentioned that. Right, I've already mentioned that. Okay. So the third section is God's decree in 7 through 9. So we have the question, the Lord's response, and now his decree in 7 through 9. God proclaims the Lord's decree in 7 through 9 and lists 5 things. What are they? Okay. Make sure I have them right here. Of course, I give you pretty much the way to gun it. A, you are my son. Today I've become your father. Okay. B, ask and I'll make the nations your inheritance. C, I will make the ends of the earth your possession. D, you shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like pottery. Verses 8 and 9 are again synonymous parallel. Let's see. I'll make the nations your inheritance and the ends of earth your possession. So you see that there, I'll make the nations your inheritance and the ends of earth your possession. Both of those two phrases are the same thing said different way, or synonymous parallelism. You'll break them with a rod of iron or dash them like a piece of pottery. Again, saying the same thing in a different way. Verse 7 is an interesting verse because it was used about Jesus for a time other than his birth. Acts 13:32 through 34, Paul states, we tell you the good news, what God promised our ancestors, he's fulfilled for us, their children, by raising up Jesus. That is written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I've become your father. God raised him from the dead so he'll never be subject to decay. So this actually says that it comes from the second Psalm. Most of the time it quotes, they don't say it comes from the second Psalm, or they usually say from David or whatever. So that's pretty cool. The writer of Hebrews does the same thing. Hebrews 1:4-5. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I've become your father? Verses 8 and 9 appear again in Revelations 2:26-28, when Jesus is talking to the church in Thyatira. Revelation 2:26-28. To the one who is victorious and does my will to the end, I'll give authority over the nations. The one will rule them with an iron scepter and will dash them to pieces like pottery. Just as I've received authority from my Father, I'll also give that one the morning star. So, and the last section is the warning to the nations in verses 10 through 12. What word in verse 10 tells us the balance of the scriptures or the conclusion? Therefore. And when it says therefore, you have to know what it's there for. Note that verse 10 uses reverse synonymous parallelism, or there's another word for that, but I used, I guess, reverse synonymous parallelism here. Anyway, verse 10. In verses 10 through 2, what are the other kings to do? Be wise, serve the Lord with fear. Verse 10, using reverse synonymous parallelism. Be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. So, yeah, basically synonymous parallelism there. Okay. Celebrate his rule with trembling, celebrate with trembling, and kiss his son. Obviously, it doesn't mean to actually kiss his son, but to believe in him wholeheartedly. In verses 11 through 12, what happens if the nations don't serve the Lord with fear? He'll be angry and your way will lead to destruction. Like all Psalms, the last sentence in verse 12 is the conclusion. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Notice how Psalm 2:12 is similar to Psalm 1:1 with the words blessed. To many commentators, this connects the two Psalms. Now, how did this psalm live on? As previously mentioned, Psalm 2 is quoted in Acts 4:25-26 when Peter and John are released from prison. Here they attribute the psalm to David. As previously mentioned, Psalm 2 is quoted in Acts 13:33-34 as proof that Jesus is the Messiah. The author of Hebrews quotes were meant in both Hebrews 1:5 and Hebrews 5:5, again as proof that Jesus is the Messiah. Also, as previously mentioned, the same words and meaning of the words are used in Revelations 2:27. Psalm 2 actually comes true in Revelations 19:19. So there you go on that. So I believe that's the end of my Psalm 2. Yes, it is. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll continue in my series on the Psalms. I do an analytical dive versus just an emotional dive. And so I hope you find that interesting. Have a great and wonderful day.